Hey everyone, it's Bema here with SFT Live. Nambaso tama latashidele shokwadele tandangade ari sane Boston ne live ledeyo. Ani hanzuki program ditiring inke ne jogire hanzu tuangi yore ngija sagyubare. Ani so dichune hanzu samadi inke ne jogire dijala. Ani nambaso tama latashidele shugo samsinyala. Hi everyone and good morning. I just wanted to introduce in Tibetan to everyone that today's episode will be in English language. If anyone is interested in seeing Tibetan language episodes with some great content, we do have that available on our Facebook page as well. So thank you everyone for joining us. And today's episode of SFT Live is focusing on the... So Sindudum is saying that he cannot hear. If you can hear, maybe give a thumbs up. Can people hear me? Awesome. Thanks, Tenzin Dakpa. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Our episode will feature two special guests, and both of them work in the field of journalism. And especially with the case of Tibet, we know that media coverage and journalism can be such a great way to actually raise awareness about these issues that are going on underneath the CCP regime, and in particular human rights violations that are taking place around the world, including in Tibet, in East Turkestan, and also in Hong Kong. So we're really excited to have our special guests. To give you a heads up, they will be Bethany from Axios and William from DW News. And so our first guest that we're hosting today is Bethany, and I'm going to give a brief bio and introduction for Bethany before I bring her onto the live. Bethany Allen-Ebrahimian is the China reporter at Axios, and before joining Axios, Bethany served as the lead reporter for the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists China Cables project, so a major leak of classified Chinese government documents revealing the inner workings of mass internment camps in East Turkestan, also known as the Chinese province of Xinjiang. Previously, Bethany was an editor and contributing reporter at Foreign Policy magazine and a national security reporter at the Daily Beast. Bethany spent 4 years in China, and she is now based in Washington, D.C. So I'm going to bring Bethany on to join us today. Hi, Bethany.
Hi.
How are you doing today?
I'm good. Can you hear me?
Yeah, the sound sounds good to me.
Okay, excellent. I'm really excited to join everyone today, and thank you so much for the invitation to come and speak with you about reporting and about issues that all of us care about.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time to come talk with us today. So the first question that I wanted to ask you today is a little bit more about yourself. I wanted to know, and I think our viewers would also love to know, how did you get started in journalism, and what made you interested in reporting on China?
So I came into journalism because of my interest in China. I lived in China for 4 years and came back to the US to get a master's degree in East Asian Studies. And originally I wanted to get a PhD in early modern Chinese history. And once I started graduate school, I decided that was not what I wanted to do. Even though I love the idea of being a historian, I just felt like there's so much in the world that's so compelling right now. And I didn't want to kind of leave all of that, for the dusty books of libraries and archives. And journalism to me was really appealing to me because it allowed me to write about China, which was my goal. I just wanted to write about China. And after I started being involved in journalism, so I started out as an intern with Foreign Policy magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And after I became involved in journalism, I started really, really caring about the field of journalism. And so I got into journalism because of my interest in China. And I've more or less always written about China or issues related to China as a journalist.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. And so we have a couple questions that we've prepared for Bethany today. That's going to get a little bit into the work that she does and some of the stories that she's covered. But if anyone has any questions, if time permitting, we will take some questions from the audience. So we're going to open it up for Q&A. So please feel free to click the question mark button at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit any questions while me and Bethany are chatting as well. So the next question I wanted to ask you was about actually an article that you wrote really recently involving Zoom and one of, a friend of SFT's who's a long-term ally, Joe François. And I just wanted to ask you first, like you covered the story, and if you don't mind sharing a little bit with the viewers today about what happened in that story, like what was the issue that you kind of decided to write about.
Sure. So what happened was there were several events that were held on Zoom around the time of the Tiananmen, the anniversary of the Tiananmen massacre. So June 4th, of course, being the infamous date. And so there were some events held that Chinese activists outside of China, in the United States or in Hong Kong, with accounts that were opened in the US or opened in Hong Kong. They were the ones that were hosting these accounts. And so what happened was the Chinese government heard about these events. I don't know for a fact how they heard about them, but I presume it was because they were advertised quietly but publicly on social media. And so what happened was the Chinese government sent requests to Zoom asking them to shut down the meetings and shut down the Zoom accounts that had hosted them. And Zoom complied more or less. There were four different issues, and so they took slightly different actions for each one, but more or less they complied. And that's really extraordinarily concerning because, again, these were accounts that were opened in the US by people who were longtime residents of the US, paid for in US dollars. And Chinese government censorship and suppression of free speech shouldn't exist at all, but it should not go outside of China's borders. And so what we have here was an example of extraterritorial censorship, essentially, that was being facilitated by Zoom. So they proceeded to shut down some accounts. And also one in Hong Kong, which again is the same concern, because traditionally there has been a lot greater freedom of speech and assembly in Hong Kong. Although, of course, right now we're seeing probably the end of that, very sadly. So the concern is this extraterritorial censorship. Now, once it became public, Zoom very quickly backtracked, reopened some of the accounts. But what they said that really was still very concerning and did nothing to allay fears and concerns about China's censorship is that Zoom said that it would quickly develop the capability to block users from mainland China. In other words, Zoom promised to get better at censoring people inside of mainland China. And so they're going to create like an internal company capability to do this, which if you want to be clever about it, you can say one company, two systems. Which is essentially what they're trying to build. And that's a theme that we have seen from an increasingly large number of not just Silicon Valley tech companies, but any kind of company that wants access to the Chinese market. And the Chinese government has increasingly learned how to leverage its control over the access to that market in order to get companies outside of China, non-Chinese companies, to facilitate its own censorship. So it's a problem that's continuing to grow. It's not getting better. And journalism, while it can cast sunlight on individual incidents, is not enough to change the tide of what's happening right now.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned, this tide of things that are going on, which is actually tying really well into a follow-up question that I wanted to ask. So when you're talking about Zoom and how Zoom as a company that's from, outside of China, obviously, and now taking the role of censoring users that are also outside of China, do you think, as a journalist, that this kind of reflects or illustrates a larger trend of how the CCP is actually trying to grow their influence to Western companies outside of their borders? And have you noticed this trend you mentioned the trend a bit, but are there any specific ways in which you've noticed this trend as well outside of the Zoom story?
Oh, absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. This is absolutely a growing trend. And it's something that the Chinese Communist Party, they want to have as much power over as many things as they can. Anything that they view as relating to China's core interests, which is something, an expanding sort of bucket of things. And I think that, so as I mentioned, basically any company that has a significant investment in China, that relies to any significant degree on access to the Chinese market, any company like that is vulnerable. Mostly what there is self-censorship. And that's much more insidious because you can't report on something that never happened in the first place. You can't get into people's brains and report on the time they didn't do that thing because they were, worried about the Chinese government. And so what happens over time is that it changes the entire conversation, the entire nature of the conversation. And I think that Tibet actually is the perfect example and the most, a very disturbing example of that, because I think that Tibetans and Tibetan communities outside of China were among the earliest victims of this kind of censorship before it was a thing, before other people paid attention to it. And we saw that as early as the 1990s. And the best example I can think of is Hollywood, when there were a couple of films in the late 1990s, most notably 7 Years in Tibet, that portrayed, the experience of the Tibetan people from their own perspective, not from the perspective of the Chinese government. And as a result of that, there were several sort of things that happened behind the scenes, but Hollywood film studios got the message very, very clearly that thou shalt not portray Tibet at all, but definitely not in a way that casts the Chinese government as invaders, or that casts Tibetan civilization, as its own people, as its own society. And so since 1997, there have not been any. When was the film about the was it the Panchen Lama?
The Kundun film?
Yes, when was Kundun?
So Kundun was 1997.
Yeah, so those were the two films. And Kundun was by Disney, right? And so for 6 months after that film was released, I think, didn't Mulan come out also right around that time? And so I think what happened was the Chinese premiere of Mulan with Chinese subtitles was canceled or held until the CEO of Disney went to China and said, I forget his exact words, but he basically said that was a terrible mistake and we'll never do it again. And indeed, Disney has never done it again. So the result of that, and I think in 100 tiny ways, the movement in the 1990s and maybe 1980s, I don't know, the Save Tibet movement, the degree to which it was a really huge international human rights issue. I mean, that movement has really gotten so quiet and does not have the same kind of influence among, for example, celebrities in Hollywood that it used to. And that is very much a result of this, exactly what we're seeing here. That was one of the earliest indicators. And one thing that I try to tell people in my reporting and in my speaking is that our mistake as people who don't have a direct, sort of family heritage that connects to China in some way, people who are not members of these ethnic communities that have been targeted by China, our mistake is thinking that this is some sort of little narrow human rights issue that, oh, that's really unfortunate for the Tibetans, but it has nothing to do with us. That is completely wrong, because the vector of power that Tibetans were victims of in the 1990s, Tibetans outside of Tibet, that vector of power has since been vastly expanded. That it's variations on a theme, and it was our mistake not to take seriously what Tibetans were experiencing then. Because Tibetan communities were the canary in the coal mine, and that's part of our larger problem in the West of putting human rights off as this little topic. There's trade and there's military and there's this little issue of human rights. No, everything we have is human rights, and when another community's rights are being suppressed, we have to pay attention to that, because that connects to everything else, and that's especially true when it comes to China.
Yeah, I think that all the points that you were kind of touching over are extremely accurate in the fact that what Tibetans were, experiencing as a people, as a movement in the 90s, and since then, in terms of the self-censorship, things like the way that China can, or CCP can, insidiously control what narrative is shared about a people. I think those kinds of behaviors that we're seeing so early on actually are a reflection of what's going on today on a more mainstream level with companies like Zoom and Apple.
Exactly.
And back then China was flexing their muscles and seeing what they could get away with, and today they've kind of become this this big power that knows they can get away with a lot more than they thought they could in the 90s, I think. So it's really great to hear you talk about the more holistic trends that have been going on since as early as, the 90s and for many decades now. So you also mentioned about how, sorry, Bethany, can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. My video seems to have frozen. Let me just can I just sort of back out and then come back in?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So we have Bethany from Axios with us today for an interview, and Bethany just had a little bit of her video froze, so she's just signing back on now. Awesome.
Okay.
Great. So you were also talking about, how Tibetans were in some cases like the canaries in the coal mine, where China was testing out all this censorship stuff on the Tibetan people and the Tibetan movement. And I think we also saw that really more recently, even in 2015, 16, where the party secretary for Tibet, who created the grid system inside Tibet, was literally taken from Tibet and then exported to, East Turkestan, where he imported the entire grid system of surveillance to the Uyghur people. So that kind of transitions me over to the topic of East Turkestan, or Xinjiang, as many people know it as, where the Uyghur people are the place where the Uyghur people call home, and in many cases have been forced out of their homes. So I know that you served as the lead reporter for the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists China Cables Project, and the major leak of classified Chinese government information revealing the inner workings of the mass internment camps in the region. So I just wanted to hear firsthand from you a little bit about the story of how did this kind of all happen? What was it like for you when this was going on? And, were there any particular, anecdotes that you could share with us and the viewers about when this was going on?
Sure. So I can't talk about the sourcing. I can't answer any questions about how I got involved. But I can talk about the process of reporting out the documents. I can talk about the first time I looked at them. So I remember, I was handed this stack of documents, and nothing was really said. I didn't really even know what they were, but I was, I had them in my hands and I was looking at them. And, over about 15 minutes, my eyes started getting really wide and I was like, what is this? What is this? And I would say it really took me about 2 weeks to really understand what it was that we had. And some of it was much clearer than others. And I would say that, so there were more or less, there were 3 kinds of documents, but for our purposes, let's say 2. One of them was what you just described, what we call the telegram, which essentially it's like an operating manual for the camps. That was a bit easier to understand because, among other things, because there had been more reporting on, we knew that the camps existed. We had, there had been some tales from people who had, some survivors. So, and also in the Western mind, and certainly I would say, the global mind, we have a concept of what is a concentration camp. We know what that is. Certainly after World War II, this is something that's sort of, burned into all of our brains. It's a category that we understand. What was more difficult for me, because we don't have this kind of category, is, so there were 4 documents that related to IJOP. That's the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. That is, we spent such a long time trying to figure out how to describe what this is. IJOP is like a predictive pre-crime platform that, through algorithms and artificial intelligence, and takes a bunch of, it's based on mass data collection. It's like a giant brain, gets a mass data collection, and it uses that to try to predict behavior that the CCP has determined to be troublesome in some way. And it spits out names, like literally it's, police officers in Xinjiang, they have an app on their phone that's connected to this big giant brain. And it literally will give them notifications of names of people that that the machine has determined to be problematic. And so police officers have to go to these people's homes and then answer a bunch of questions into the app. And then some large percentage of these people are then taken and put into these concentration camps. So you have, it's like, I don't know, what is it like? What's a good analogy for this? It's like detention by algorithm, sort of. And it's a pre-crime thing. So like, we have determined that you have done a number of behaviors that our algorithm determines means you're susceptible to, in the future, committing a crime that we determine to be a crime, such as religious extremism, which means that you pray a lot or something. So some of these documents were looking at that, and that was really difficult to report on and to even understand, because there's so little information in the public space about that, because this stuff is a state secret in China. But anyway, so the process of reporting through that, there was one moment I remember that sort of the gravity of what we were doing really sunk into me, and that was looking at one of these documents from IJOP, which again are connected to the camps, because IJOP is sort of a platform by which some large number of people are actually detained and put into camps. And I remember one of these documents, it said, it was so matter of fact, it was so clinical, it's a report. It said, in the 1 week period between June 14th and June 21st, 2017, IJOP produced 24,188 names. These names were sent down to all of the public security bureaus around Xinjiang. Of those people, 16,000 or so were rounded up and put into vocational training facilities, put into concentration camps. The end. 16,000 lives just not literally ended, but put into these terrible facilities, their life destroyed, utterly destroyed, in like 2 sentences, just so clinical. And I remember looking at that and just sort of sitting with it and thinking, who are these 16,000 people that their lives were destroyed by an algorithm, and then the rest of that report talked about why they had not been able to detain even more of them. So there were 24,000 names put forward, 16,000 of them detained. It was a 6-point list of reasons they hadn't been able to get even more of them. And I still can't really grasp that or deal with that, what kind of evil that is.
Yeah, I mean, earlier you were asking like if there's a word, and I think like there's nothing on any scale that compares kind of in human history with what the CCP has been doing to innocent people, people that are just trying to practice their religion freely. But a word that always comes to my mind is techno dystopia. Like, we are living in a world in which technology is being used in a way to oppress and silence people that it's never been used in the past before, and to this magnitude. And I think that this is kind of a time when the international community and the tech industry in particular really needs to take a long, hard look at what innovation and technology will look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now, if the trend with what the CCP has been doing in East Turkestan and in Tibet with their grid systems and surveillance continues. I think that this is the type of technology that can really easily be transferred over to other countries and other regimes.
Yes, exactly.
Even, for example, in the United States right now, where we have this mass, student-led movement where Black and brown activists are coming out and, calling for equality. And then seeing how, for example, it's been criminalized in many ways by the government, or there's been rhetoric where they criminalize this. I think the example can be seen in the US, where, for example, the amount of Tupac Shakur or radical Black writers people are listening to might impact, whether or not they're put into a re-educational camp. That's like the kind of what we're looking at, where people are pursuing their own interests in their own homes, and that's being used as a way to justify. I think what really scares me too is that when you think about at the international level with bodies like the UN, where China's counterterrorism efforts are actually being seen as a positive thing, where people are not seeing what human impact it has on the ground and how terrible it actually is in terms of human rights. But they hail China as being a leader in the fight against terrorism. And that's kind of been a strong narrative that we've heard coming out of multilateral forums as well.
It's a lie. It's propaganda. they are not fighting terrorism in Xinjiang. They're fighting a people.
Absolutely.
And it's easy for them to call it that because after 9/11, you know, the world has come to equate Muslims with terrorism. You know, and so it's so easy. There's such a ready-made audience that wants to believe that you know, is ready to believe that what China's doing in Xinjiang is counterterrorism. It's not. It's cultural genocide, and I think Tibetans understand that more than anyone.
Absolutely. And, you know, we even saw, for example, in a report on counterterrorism we did with Tibet groups at the UN level, where they had even, there was, I think, over 200 Tibetans arrested in the year of 2018 for under charges of counterterrorism. So I think this trend we're seeing, like the same way that they took the grid system from Tibet to East Turkestan, they also bring these surveillance and counterterrorism measures right back to Tibet and back and forth. But yeah, thank you for sharing that experience with us. I know that was a really deeply moving time for you, and it was a difficult time for everyone who was following the news, I think.
Yeah. One thing I always, when people ask me about this, what I always want to say is that, you know, sometimes people ask me like, oh, do you feel worried about your own safety? And I always say, no, I am fine. Don't spend 1 second worrying about me. I am completely fine. What, you know, it's the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. They're the ones who are going through this. They're the ones who have to be brave. They're the ones whose lives are being crushed and have to survive somehow. So I always urge people to think of them.
Awesome. Well, I did have some more questions, but I see that there was some Q&A questions that let me see if I can get to them. So we can't actually see the full question that Pema Dolkar added. So Pema Dolkar, if you're watching live and you want to ask your question, we can't view the full thing because it's too long for the app. So maybe you can type it into the comments. But another question we have from Kunta is, what can we do to stop self-censorship from Hollywood and other American companies? And I guess that would be from your perspective as a reporter, as a journalist.
Yeah. Did I freeze up again? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you well. I think your video might be frozen. Yep, I think we're good now. Can you hear me, Bethany? I can't hear you. Awesome. So I think Bethany is going to join back up again.
Okay, back? Yes?
Yep.
Good. Okay, great.
Perfect.
All right. So what can be done about, for example, censorship and self-censorship in Hollywood? Great question. There's a range of answers, and I think we're still, as a society, we're still working on what can be done. I would say there's a range of answers from what we are doing right now all the way to essentially total decoupling, which is to say no cooperation between Hollywood and China, Hollywood films not being shown in China, etc. So it's this whole entire spectrum of everything in between. What we're doing right now, what we're basically relying on, is civil society, journalism, transparency, this kind of thing. This has clearly been insufficient. This is not enough. And so for people to say, you know, we need more transparency, or, you know, we need, like, name and shame. Name and shame is not enough. And people who are saying that we need more name and shame are simply not grappling with the nature of the problem and the scale of the problem. So the nature of the problem is money. That's what's happening here. That's the only thing that's happening here. You know, the Chinese film market is the largest or the second largest film market in the world, you know, to the US, depending on how you measure it. There's millions and millions and millions of dollars to be made there. And as long as that money is held out as a carrot, filmmakers are gonna, you know, they're gonna go for it in one way or another. And being done on an ad hoc basis, whenever journalists are able to, like, you know, for they do some kind of investigation, that is not enough. So what does that mean then? Did
Yes,
I
I can
freeze
hear
up
you.
again? Can you hear me?
Hey, Bethany, can you hear me? I think that now you're frozen as well for video and sound. Let's see. Okay, I think your video is back now. Let's see the... no, not the sound. Should we try? Let's try it another time. So I think Bethany's signal was, she needs to be added really quickly. So we're getting Bethany back on, and thank you for our friends from Uyghur Congress. They commented and said, thank you, Bethany, for your tireless work. So I was reading a comment from World Uyghur Congress. It said, thank you, Bethany, for your tireless work in exposing the atrocities committed by the Chinese Communist Party. We appreciate you and your work.
Oh, that's so nice. Thanks, guys. I haven't done enough work. There's a lot more work to be done. So back to the question of what can be done. I think that there is definitely a space for legislation here. And I think there's a range. So I think that, you could create some kind of special channel for whistleblowers. So people inside of Hollywood, one of the big problems there is self-censorship, and people maybe who know that it's wrong, they think that it's wrong, but they know that their jobs are at stake if they talk about it. So a special channel for whistleblowers, more than a hotline, but some kind, and special protections. I think a law, for example, that makes it illegal for someone in Hollywood to lose their job for speaking out specifically about Chinese censorship, that would help. Depending on how far you want to push it, there was actually a law introduced in the House. I don't think it has any chance of passing. But that would make it illegal for U.S. companies to punish or discipline workers for speaking out about, for criticizing China. I think you could also take that law and make it illegal for a company to punish or discipline a worker or terminate them for being a whistleblower on Chinese censorship. I think so. That would be maybe just one step, just a way to strengthen transparency, but without necessarily dealing with the actual problem itself. At this point, we're going to get into stuff that I think would be really difficult to pass in the U.S. because we're getting into interfering with private business, which Americans are kind of allergic to. But laws that restrict Hollywood's ability to engage with the Chinese market, say, the U.S. government's going to get more involved in that and say, put disclosure requirements. If you want to, market your movie in China, you need to have all these disclosures. You need to sign a thing saying that you're not going to censor, blah, 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 something like that. At the end of the day, we're going to see this as long as as long as Hollywood movies can be shown in China. Yeah. And that's, it's authoritarian capitalism, it's sharp power, it's whatever you want to call it. It's basically the Chinese government having learned how to take capitalism, international capitalism, turn it around and use it as a vector for their authoritarian values. And unless we're willing to put democratic guardrails on capitalism, we're going to keep seeing this problem.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that your examples of, things that people can do are extremely effective because, as you said it as well, like the name and shame, it's been going on for some time now, but it really isn't enough because there's only so much that activists and journalists and, whistleblowers can really do on their own from outside. But we need folks that are inside kind of the industry as well to start speaking up. And I also feel like, for example, making it a choice between, right now, China is using the capitalist market as a way to actually silence people. But there hasn't really been enough kind of vocal outcry from people that are living in free countries saying like, well, actually, if this X, Y, and Z company is doing this to play into China's self-censorship, then that's a problem for us. So they're not choosing between two markets. They're choosing between one market or two markets. That's kind of what the choice has been now. So I think definitely also shifting it to a choice between two separate markets is also really crucial. But thank you so much for all the work that you've done, Bethany. And I think that a lot of our viewers have sent in really great support for you. We have Pushari said, "Thank you, Bethany," from a Tibetan student. And Kunta, who asked the question, said, "Thank you so much. That was a very clear answer." So we actually do have to head over to our next guest today. But thank you so much for joining us today, Bethany. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Bethany is a reporter with Axios, and you can see their at right up here. So if anyone wants to see more of the work that they've done, such as the article that they released this week with the Zoom article about Feng Shuo, one of our friends of SFT, you can make sure to keep up Axios on Instagram and online to hear more of the work that they're doing over there.
Thank you so much. And say hi to William for me.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think he's
Bye,
actually
everybody.
Watching right now.
Oh, is he? Hi, William. Bye,
Thanks.
everybody.
Bye, Bethany. Awesome. So that was a really great discussion that we had with Bethany from Axios. Our next guest today is William Yang, who is a Taiwanese journalist who covers political and human rights stories from East Asia. He actually covers news for several media outlets and is published in news sources such as Deutsche Welle, DW News, The Independent, The Guardian, BuzzFeed News, and more. And I'm going to go ahead and add William to our live now. Hi, William.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty good.
Where are you based right now?
I'm in Taipei, so we're actually expecting a long weekend. So it's like yeah, I'm in a really good mood right now.
Oh, okay. And it seems like it's quite late there as well, right?
Yeah, it's fine. Like yeah, I can stay up late tonight. So yeah.
Awesome. Jenny Wang said, "Yay, William!" And
Hi,
also Bethany
Jenny.
said hi earlier.
Right. Yeah, I saw that.
And Ditch and Jay commented you're lopsided. I think it's because your screen is showing as sideways. Just to let you know.
Right. Should I turn it around?
Yeah, sure. Actually, if I mean,
Okay.
it's
All right. Let me. Is this better? Yeah.
yeah. I mean, just it doesn't matter. If you want to go sideways, that's fine as well.
No,
Perfect.
I think yeah, this is fine. Yeah.
Okay, great. And so we're just gonna get started. And the first question that I had for you today was the same one that I had for Bethany as well. I wanted to hear a little bit more about you and your life and career in journalism, and if you wanted to share about what made you interested to join journalism in the first place, and then also to cover this this area of news.
Right. So, as a Taiwanese national growing up, I was very, very aware about, Taiwan's international situation, especially, China's international bullying and marginalization of Taiwan for decades, and how Taiwan was not able to really earn any international recognition for, the status that it's ought to be recognized as, and also at the same time, it's in fact, I think, I'm sure the Tibetans and the Uyghurs and the people in Hong Kong, we can all relate to that, because we're all kind of like facing the similar experience for decades. And then so I in fact originally wanted to be more focusing on human rights work rather than journalism. But the opportunity came when I applied for grad school in the States, and I was looking at my options of being engaged in human rights works, and I realized that maybe I'm not smart enough, or I won't be hardworking enough for law school. That's how a lot of the human rights lawyers and human rights workers got their foot into the realm of human rights. So I decided that I really like writing, and I love interacting with people, and I love telling stories as well. So why don't I try a degree in journalism? And that also allows me to be involved in human rights works in a function that still has a lot of credibility, but at the same time, it allows me to really learn and share these experiences and shine lights on very important issues through personal stories. So that's how I got into journalism school, and I went through some internships, including with Human Rights Watch in New York, and also Mercy Corp in Zimbabwe, and then I came back to Taiwan, and that's how I started my journalism career.
That's really interesting, William, actually, because I noticed from both you and Bethany that journalism, although you both have a passion for journalism, the true kind of core passion is human rights and the region, and journalism has kind of become like a channel through which you can express that, the desire to create positive change for human rights in the region. So I think it shows that, journalism is really a tool for creating change.
Right, for sure.
Yeah. So the first question that I had, before I ask the questions that I've prepared, again, same thing for William, as we're having our conversation, if there's any questions that come up, please feel free to drop them in the question box down below. So there's just a question mark next to the comments, and if you click it there, I'll be able to see all the questions in one place. In the comments, I'll try to keep up, but sometimes they get lost in the comments. So I believe it was just yesterday when you reported on 2 Chinese activists who were arrested after being put on Rsdl. So
right.
I just wanted to ask you first and foremost, like for our viewers and for everyone, what is Rsdl? And can you explain a little bit about, for those who may be watching, who are these activists, and explain why they were kind of in this situation?
Right. So the story involves 2 very prominent human rights. In fact, they're pro-democracy activists in China. They have been pushing for pro-democracy movements in China for decades, and they're very well-known intellectuals. One used to be teaching at Beijing University, and the other one was a very long time human rights lawyer. And both have been the only reason why they were detained and forced into disappearance this time around was because they attended a private dinner in Xiamen City in the Fujian province, and during the dinner they were talking about the future of China and their vision for China. And only because of that, 13 days after that dinner, they a bunch of them were rounded up, raided, their homes were raided, and they were taken away by police from their home in different parts of China. So first of all, that just shows us how, scary the Chinese censorship regime is, because for sure, the information maybe they have been exchanging in private have been, caught up by the Chinese government, and they were able to, in fact, know like who were the participants of that particular private dinner. And then the 2 of them, they were then transferred into the so-called residential surveillance at a designated place. This is a very specific treatment that the Chinese government often used to put the dissidents on, make the prominent dissidents disappear, and then during this time, they will be confined at an unknown location for up to 6 months. And during the 6 months time, they will be basically put in solitary confinement, and the police can interrogate them at any point of the day. And usually, in the past, there have been other individuals who survived Rsdl and then left China and then shared the insights. And the conditions in these solitary confinement, why it is very torturing, is because oftentimes the lights in the room was kept on 24/7. And so basically, the individual who is put under that Rsdl was basically unable to really get rest. And the police would often put them in a very fixed position for hours while they were interrogating them. And this Rsdl's the sole purpose is to force the individual to give in and confess or own up to the crime or the charges that the Chinese government assigned to these individuals in a way, at a point when they were on the brink of breakdown, physical, mental, and spiritual, all kinds of breakdowns. And so that is why this is just another example of how the Chinese government is very insecure about criticism against them, and also suggestions that constructive suggestions that are often being provided by these intellectuals, because they see it as a threat to the stability of the regime. And just after months of being locked up in these unknown locations, these two prominent activists, Xu Ziyong and also Ding Jiaxi, they were finally being confirmed as officially arrested. The ironic part of this is that, in fact, they have been arrested and detained for months, but because they were never being officially, confirmed to be arrested. So, which means that the family or for the last few months were unable to get any information and update about these individuals, and like the official acknowledgement of their arrest means that probably one of them or both of them have been forced into confession, some form of confession of the crime that they were charged with. So this particular case, in fact, has a lot of implication for what is going to happen in Hong Kong. As we know, the national security law currently being discussed and rushed through the Chinese parliament is actually going to bring shockwaves to Hong Kong. And a lot of the concerns about the details of the law, which is remain very, very murky right now, is that China is basically going to impose its definition of rule of law onto Hong Kong, which has a completely different set of judicial system, and also the idea of rule of law is very, very different. And so that is basically destroying the way of life in Hong Kong, and people are very, very concerned about it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what you're talking about with RSDL, it's really just a fancy different way of saying forced disappearance and torture.
Right.
So thank you for sharing about the case and the story of these two activists whose story you had covered about their experience with RSDL inside under the CCP. And so you did transition it over slightly to Hong Kong as well. And I had another question as well, but I'm going to just jump to the next one, which is about Hong Kong. So I know that you have covered Hong Kong quite a bit in the recent years, and I wanted to ask, as you have been covering Hong Kong, with all the escalation with protests and the national security law and whatnot over the past several years, have you noticed any differences in free press and media access, especially from your perspective as a journalist, as a reporter, since the beginning of the Hong Kong protests and the umbrella movement several years back now?
Right. So it's in fact a very, very sad and tragic witness that I have been, personally there to see the whole deterioration of the state of free press in Hong Kong. As we know, Hong Kong used to be the beacon of free press in China or even in Asia, because it has the degree of freedom of speech that people inside anywhere in China would never be able to enjoy or even imagine. But since the 2014 umbrella movement, the Hong Kong government and also the central government in Beijing ramped up their crackdown on civil society, especially on pro-democracy movement, pro-democracy camps. And what they did is that they started passing all these different kinds of legislations in different different names, but the goal is the same, is to shrink the space for the so-called pro-democracy movement, and also the fight for universal suffrage, which again is being promised in the joint declaration when when China and the UK government were signing that before they hand over back to China. And so what is really sad is that we started seeing journalists, especially since last summer when the protests broke out in Hong Kong. I was there the entire summer, and what we experienced is that the police started becoming really, really aggressive towards not only the protesters but also the journalists. We were being treated with pepper sprays, even just for not willing to back down for doing our job, because our job was to be there to document what's happening. But a lot of the times they don't want what they are doing during the arrest of protesters to be documented by journalists. So they would shine strong flashlights into the eyes of the group of journalists, they will use pepper spray to force us to back down, and also they even use a water cannon to just like splash all over a group of journalists on the overpass because we were trying to take pictures about how the police and the protesters were clashing underneath us, and that's just an unprecedented level of violence that we would never imagine even before last summer. The deterioration of the treatment of journalists and also the access of journalists because of the mass level of arrest. Close to 10,000 people have been arrested since last summer in Hong Kong, and a lot of them have been charged with very in my opinion, unfair charges that does not match with what they did during the protest. And so because of the fear of being charged and also prosecuted, a lot of these sources then become either reluctant to talk to journalists, or also they need a lot of assurance and also level of security before they are willing to sort of share their stories. That actually is also a very, very large damage to the state of press freedom, and also it comes into the way for the world to really learn about what's happening in Hong Kong. So I think the loss of state of freedom and also the fact that Hong Kong will probably no longer serve as the hub for not only local media but foreign media as well is going to have a huge impact on the world's understanding about Hong Kong and also the world's understanding about what China is doing. So a lot of the media organizations will soon probably have to be faced with the tough choice of, do they remain in Hong Kong and somehow operate within the accepted realm that is given under the national security law, or do they pick another base for them to operate and continue to cover China? But as we know, the censorship regime in China is so powerful that it has become much harder for people outside of China to cover it, and people inside China are also taking a lot of risks. So this is just the overall deterioration of the state of free press that will have a huge implication in the coming years.
Yeah, no, I think that what you're describing about all the things that are happening on the ground inside Hong Kong, we have a ton of viewers commenting with thumbs up and words of support. So I think that it's just very clear that many people are extremely grateful for the work of all the reporters that have been on the ground in the front lines covering these protests in Hong Kong, especially. And also, I feel like as a Tibetan myself, it's like a looking glass where we can see in, because inside Tibet there is not even there are not even journalists that are allowed to go to the region to cover any stories. So although the situation in Hong Kong is very bad right now, due to the fact that there are still reporters allowed on the ground, we can kind of get a glimpse into the way that the CCP and the police state and the Hong Kong police have been treating the protesters and to people that are brave enough to speak up against the brutality of the CCP.
Right.
My next question was, I think you covered a little bit already in your answer, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about, in your views, are there any major differences between covering Hong Kong versus mainland China? And what are some of the challenges of covering each of the two regions? And as of right now, would you say that today there's, it's harder or easier to cover one of these regions over the other?
So, traditionally, it's in fact very easy for anyone to try to cover stories in Hong Kong. And comparing to China, as a Taiwanese national and also as someone who has been writing so much about human rights violations in China, including the Xinjiang re-education camps in Hong Kong and some Tibetan stories, I would never be able to set foot onto China in my lifetime. That is definitely for sure. So that, already puts a level of difficulty for me to really access factual information inside China. So for human rights stories, particularly in China, what I usually do is I partner with different human rights organizations who that has been systematically tracking the information or the development inside China. So I've been in depth for their valuable work and dedication to keeping that updated. And my job, I think, is to just amplify the research that they've done and also the findings that they do, and also try as much as I can to really add the human side of the story to the entire incident, so that the world will be able to have a very comprehensive understanding of that. And so most of my reporting for China is relying on my connection with the human rights groups, but also at the same time through the sources that I've built up over the years, because a lot of them are in fact very well-connected activists or human rights lawyers inside China. So they would be able to help me to connect to news sources who are unfortunately being oppressed by the Chinese government. And so digital security becomes a very key thing for me. I always need to make sure that my sources, or the way that of communication between me and my sources are safe enough that it will not be tracked or infiltrated by the Chinese government. Whereas in Hong Kong, it's just a very sad descendants into a similar situation in China. So what I have experienced and witnessed over the last, I would say, 24 months. It's just that, Hong Kong turned from a very, very open and diverse a society with diverse opinions into this society that started to have chilling effects. And also you see people being punished for talking to the press or taking part in protests. And that just brings up a lot of the very scary and ironic similarity between Hong Kong and China more and more. And it's actually, in fact, very sad to see how, a city that used to be known for its open-mindedness and also the commitment to democratic rule and also rule of law is deteriorating into the same state as China. And it's all because of the fact that the Chinese government feels threatened by people living in Hong Kong, and also the ambition of the Chinese Communist Party is just being expanded because of their growing confidence internationally. So, as we see the way that they have been, I think, step by step taking total control over Hong Kong, we need to be very, very careful, and also keep in mind that there's always going to be the next place that's going to face the similar situation. And Taiwan has been brought up a lot since last year's the protests broke out in Hong Kong, just because of the fact that one country, two systems is in fact one of the proposals that the Chinese government has been using on trying to convince Taiwan to be unify with Taiwan. But with the Xinjiang re-education camps happening over the last 2.5 years, and also with what's happening in Hong Kong, and also for decades what had been happening in Tibet, the Taiwanese people are waking up about the reality about what kind of government the Chinese regime is. It really is, and also what they are capable of doing in order to get the society under control. So I think it's sad to see how all of you guys, Tibetans, Uyghurs, and Hong Kongers, having to go through this in order for Taiwanese people to be able to have this awakening moment. But I think this is also helping to really strengthen the alliance and the support between each of these groups, so that we will not be just trying to resist against the CCP's oppression alone.
So actually, I do have one more question for you, but I'm conscious of the time, as we only have 60 minutes on Instagram Live. So the live's going to end in about a minute. But the next question that I had for you, which I'm going to share, if you don't mind, William, would you mind if we restart a new live?
Sure. Yeah, let's do it.
So I'm going to read the question now so that the viewers can tune in again and hear your answers to this question. The question was, you have reported on, for example, arrests of citizen journalists who were covering the COVID-19 pandemic in Wuhan, China. And I wanted to know a little bit more about what your key takeaways from how China has cracked down on journalists in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, and about what you believe the role of journalists is when it comes to covering coronavirus in China. And then another question was, how can journalists find accurate information when the government is, clearly taking the full effort to actually cover up this true situation even further. So that's the question that we're going to be chatting with William about next on the next live. So I'm going to end here, and then once we start a new live, make sure to tune in to hear the answer to the question. Thank you, William.
Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining back again. We were just live right now with William Yang from DW News, and we actually ended up running out of time because we had some really great discussions with William as well as with Bethany. So I'm just bringing William back with us again. So I think many of folks are tuning in from the previous live. I wanted to also mention there was a couple folks that had submitted questions. I think like Kushal 74K and Uyghur Congress had both submitted questions. So if folks want to submit their questions again, please feel free to do so. Hey William, thanks for joining us again.
Hi.
In case anyone is just tuning in now, William Yang is a Taiwanese journalist who covers political and human rights stories from East Asia for several international media outlets, including Deutsche Welle, DW News, The Independent, The Guardian, BuzzFeed News, and many more. And so we're really happy to have William with us. We had just ended our previous live where we, chatted about some of the Chinese activists that William covered in a story really recently, as well as about some of his work covering the Hong Kong protests since the Umbrella Movement and the past several years. And the next question that we're going to cover today was about the coronavirus pandemic and COVID-19. So I'll just repeat the question again, William, in case some folks are tuning in now. So William has, reported on the arrest of several citizen journalists who were initially covering the COVID-19 pandemic in Wuhan. And so my question for William was, what are some of your key takeaways from how China has cracked down on journalists in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic?
So I think what the arrest of the 4 citizen journalists who were physically in Wuhan during the lockdown and the height of the COVID-19 outbreak over there is that it is, again, the reflection of a long history of how the Chinese government has been, the Chinese Communist Party has been really relying on in order to maintain stability and control over civil societies. They try to control access to very sensitive yet very explosive information that oftentimes will in fact bring out the different side of the government that people in China might not usually have the access to actually understand. And these information oftentimes are potentially able to inspire or trigger a wider discussion or even awakening moment again inside China. So ever since the June 4th Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, that is the point of deterioration of the space for civil society and also civil rights inside China. So we have been seeing, activists and human rights lawyers being locked up and unjustly prosecuted and detained for years. And then, again, the way that the 4 citizen journalists were forced into disappearance, they were only one of them, so far 4 months after the outbreak and 4 months after the first citizen journalist disappeared. Only one of them have officially been charged, and the rest of them, the other 3 of them, 2 of them still remain very remain unknown, their whereabouts remain unknown, and whereas the other one went missing in a very dramatic live video where the police were knocking on his door and they were prepared to break into the place that he was staying in Wuhan before he gave himself in. And he suddenly resurfaced in a YouTube video, and instead of in fact using a live video, but he pre-recorded everything and kind of put everything together in a way that it seemed like he was instructed to tell the world what happened during the time that he disappeared. So that this is again a very I think a very sophisticated regime that is very capable of coercing its own citizens into giving in to the pressure that it is putting on these individuals. And if these individuals are not willing to give in, oftentimes they would just be kept in the dark for until they are, like willing to either make the compromises to own up to the charges that they were given, or own up to the punishment that they were given. Or the other way around is that if the international pressure on the particular individuals were strong enough, oftentimes that would allow, force the Chinese government to kind of like went halfway to at least allow the international community to know the whereabouts and conditions of these individuals. So again, I think the larger agenda of why the Chinese government is detaining citizen journalists for simply sharing information on the ground in Wuhan is, again, there must be something that in Wuhan that the Chinese government doesn't want the world to know and doesn't want the Chinese society to know. So they consider the role of journalists uncovering all these like very, very raw materials on the ground as a serious threat to the image that they're trying to paint, which, as we know, in the beginning of the COVID-19, they painted as a successful campaign for defeating the deadly virus. But in fact, it is only because the access to information is so restricted that people were only able to have so much that they know. And I think you also ask about, what does it mean for how do journalists actually have access to real and factual information? I think oftentimes we need to really, applaud the hard work for the local Chinese national journalists that have been really dedicated to uncovering all the information and going really deep to the grassroots level to talk to people that are directly impacted by a lot of the high-level policies that the central government never envisioned the impact of that. And so a lot of the times these individuals or the activists who were trying to speak up for a group of vulnerable people, they are the ones that are carrying all the biggest burdens and baggages in order to bring these very precious information to the rest of the world. So what we as foreign correspondents who focus on China and who are outside of China can do is to really what I usually do is I would be closely following the information shared by human rights groups again, or individuals that I trust and have a very strong track record for advocating for human rights works inside China. In fact, Feng Suo is a very, very useful and well-resourced guy who, even though he lives in the States, he continues to be very plugged in for a lot of what's happening inside China. So I rely on these individuals a lot, or also rely on the sources that I have developed over the years, and or I try to follow organically a citizen-run like websites or GitHub pages in order to really get access to the information inside China that the outside world may not be able to have access to. And so that, I think, what allows a journalist to do that is, you really need to be able to, unfortunately, have a certain level of Mandarin ability, but at the same time, you really also need to be sensitive enough to know what are the protocols that you should be practicing when you are doing all these very high-risk reporting, because any wrong step may expose an individual and push them to a dangerous situation or to the arm of the Chinese government. So there are many layers of very sensitive tasks, or also things, a list of factors that you need to keep China.
Yeah, I think that what you mentioned is really such a key point. Is that as a society around the world living in free countries, we really need to thank and appreciate the kind of risks that people on the ground, journalists, local journalists, and activists are taking in order to break the news. So when we hear about something, when we read about something in the news in the United States or in Europe about a new, information being leaked, or an interview with someone from inside that's anonymous, these are real people that are taking tremendous risks to their own lives in order to help spread the news and information with the rest of the world.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah. So that was our last question that we had for you today, William. And thank you so much for staying to chat with us extra. I think that we covered some really interesting and important topics like the RSDL and, you know, the Hong Kong protests as well as the coronavirus pandemic. And I know it's quite late for you as well. And thank you for taking the time to chat with us on Instagram Live.
No, thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, William, and enjoy your long weekend as well.
You too.
Take
Bye.
care. Goodbye. So thank you everyone who tuned in for today's episode of SFT Live. We had two incredible journalists, Bethany and William from Axios and DW News, who both cover some really important and sensitive issues that are going on inside under the CCP regime today. They shared a lot of great information with us about the importance, but also the risks and challenges of covering these stories. So before I tune off for today's episode, I wanted to make a quick announcement. It's that the next episode of SFT Live is going to be happening this Sunday, June 28th at 12 p.m. Eastern, which is also 5 p.m. in the UK and 6 p.m. for a lot of Europe. And this episode, I suggest everyone to tune in. It's going to be focusing on Pride Month, as June is considered to be a month where we celebrate and commemorate the beautiful, identity of LGBTQ community and also the history of the struggle of LGBTQ community. So our Pride episode will have, speakers, guests that are from the community and in particular who have, graciously offered to take the time to speak with us about the issue of LGBTQ Pride Month as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in for today's episode. If you want to take more actions on some of the work and campaigns SFT has been kind of focusing on, please feel free to check out the link in our bio. So if you go up to Students for a Free Tibet, SFT_international, the link in our bio has a ton of different ways that you can get involved in the movement by signing petitions or sending letters to politicians and joining campaigns. So thanks everyone for tuning in. Have a great day.